You are not allowed, St. John the Forerunner's words rebuking the king of Israel, King Herod the Great. And these words, of course, pertain to our sins as well. It's not allowed to you was a rebuke that St. John the Baptist of Christ addressed to King Herod, the ruler at the behest of the Roman Emperor. The consequence of this provocative attitude for any ruler was the arrest and imprisonment of the forerunner, but holiness sometimes bends the arrogance of the ruler, and that is why King Herod, who was afraid of him, called the prisoner from time to listen to his words with pleasure and applied some of his advice. The modern rationalist will be quick to interpret Herod's fear as an outgrowth of the superstition of the pre-scientific period of history. Perhaps because many of us suffer from a lack of experience of holiness. St. John did not go to meet people, people went to meet him. This is a primary characteristic of the saint throughout time. He grew up in the desert, feeding on locusts and wild honey. Locusts, of course, are not the locust insects. He was feeding on something called locusts, which were desert plants. Okay? This I uploaded a video a few days ago describing that locusts were not the insects that he ate. He ate desert plants and wild honey. Undergoing extremely hard training, asceticism, he was a hermit. There is a difference in the interpretation of the word locust, whether it's the insect that is extremely destructive to the seeds or the tender tips of sprouts. Well, they were the tender tips of the sprouts of the desert. In our time, the consumption of insects is beginning to be promoted as a solution to the global food problem, and everyone is silent before the blatant hypocrisy. Could it be that the goal of those dreaming of this eating behavior is to reduce us to the ascetic height of Christ's baptism? But exercise is derided in our time as lacking meaning and depriving us of pleasure, if not enjoyment, in our lives. Critics fail or do not want to understand that asceticism and spiritual practice according to Christ's teaching is not an end in itself, but a means to combat passions on the way to holiness. Through the exercise, the saints managed to tame the greatest passion, that of pride, which distinguishes not only the rulers, but those also who called the people to fight for the overthrow of the established order. The exercise, the practice, gave St. John the courage to clash with authority, knowing the consequences. He called the religious leadership, who later handed Christ over to Pilate, born of vipers, and they despised him for that. But he was visited in the crowd of people, not only by the unworthy who sought consolation in their suffering, but also by the socially powerful, such as the publicans and the soldiers. To the many who asked for his advice, he emphasized, "He who has 2 tunics should give one to someone who does not have one." This is a sermon of introduction to the new teaching of Christ, which constitutes an overcoming of the Mosaic law of almsgiving of the tithe. To love your neighbor as yourself means to share everything with him. Of course, this means like a utopia. It seems like a utopia. That's why the saints trouble us, because they showed with their lives that this is happening. So it leaves us speechless. It took place in the first church of Jerusalem, in which everything was communal. Now, the tradition is preserved in the Christian Orthodox community. Centuries later, social reformers rose up against social injustice by promising an earthly paradise in the absence of God, which they denied. Failure has been devastating, and greed is rampant. The saint advised the publicans, the predatory vultures of that time, who prepaid the Romans so that they could receive permission to collect taxes, not to be greedy. Were they all convinced? Certainly not. But one, Matthew, the tax collector, became a disciple of Christ. He advised the military not to abuse power by draining the sweat of the people, but to limit themselves to their salaries. Were they all convinced? Some definitely. Unlike Herod's control, which was done for religious illegality. Adultery. Controlling others was for social justice issues. The sermons of Christ and the fathers of the church against avarice are unsurpassed. And yet impassioned critics of the church, ignoring the text of the New Testament and the works of the social fathers of the church, lightly characterize the church as a timeless crutch of power, identifying the church, the divine institution, with the persons, the lay people, mainly rulers, and clergy, bishops mainly, which in their lives they scandalize with actions or omissions. Actions to bless rulers with anti-church policy or to be silent when they should have shouted, "You are not allowed to do that." The bright examples of St. John, and above all of Jesus Christ, the eternal model, were followed by the saints of the church. St. Basil the Great, when threatened by the commander of the East to submit to the will of the emperor in order not to suffer its consequences, replied that he is not afraid of confiscation. He who has as his only possession a tattered cassock and a few books is not afraid of exile because the whole earth is God's. He's not afraid of torture because of his weak body. His weak body bows down to the first blow. St. Gregory the theologian resigned from the patriarchal throne of Constantinople, today's Istanbul, in the Byzantine Empire, because some unworthy bishops contested his election, and he retired to live in a hut. St. John Chrysostom, the bishop of Constantinople, broke with the palaces by denouncing social injustice. He made enemies in the palace of the unworthy bishops as well, who were disturbed by the strict adherence to church tradition. He was dethroned as bishop and died in exile. And of course, the cases of bright examples were not a feature of only the first, after Christ, centuries. Throughout time, the church highlights both martyrs and holy ascetics who despised everything that many of us consider important and are passionate about acquiring, that is, wealth, power, and pleasures. And that's why the disturbances, that's why the social upheavals, that's why the wars. And yet, with lightness, the Church of Christ of love is criticized for all the evils of the man empowered by God. Materialist worldviews consider economic as the main, if not exclusive, motivation of human actions. How casually they consider and interpret human behavior. Herodias did not hesitate to point to her daughter Salome instead of accepting half of Herod's hegemony, a human head, that of John the Baptist. The multifarious analysts of man are tragically ignorant of human passions and the descent to which they can lead man. Thus they discredit martyrdom, as it trivializes their analysis of the human person, which they ignore, insisting on the use of the term person, but they project a person who sacrifices his life for some of the so-called universal ideals, such as freedom, justice, peace. But even these examples shatter the cheap materialist interpretation of the economic motivation of every action. Materialism would only be verified if everyone submitted to the mighty authority and carried out its orders. But fortunately, this does not happen. In contrast to the demagogues who promised the people earthly paradises, Christ, who was characterized as the sower of supreme utopia, warned us that few will walk in the narrow path which he himself carved. Many will walk the broad avenue of submission to power and passions, and in history the avenue was chosen not only by persons outside the church, but also by many baptized Christians. They gave their reasons to criticize Christ and his church. Passionate, at the same time stupid, the tactics of the enemies of the church, Christ stands before us and asks us the question, does he test me for sin? The saints dared to ask the same question despite human frailties. Unable to face their brilliance and the extreme consistency of words and works, we prefer to disparage them or belittle them, but this attitude does not diminish Christ and his saints, it degrades us. This I've translated from a Greek article. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.